Christopher Nolan has returned to the biggest screens in the world with what is undoubtedly one of the most talked about and anticipated films of the decade, his adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey. After the enormous commercial and critical success of Oppenheimer, Nolan found himself in a position that very few filmmakers will ever reach. He had complete creative freedom. He could have made another original science fiction blockbuster, another spy thriller, or honestly anything a major Hollywood studio could finance. Instead, he chose to adapt one of the oldest surviving works of literature ever written, a story that has inspired writers, artists, filmmakers, and storytellers for nearly 3,000 years. Of course, this isn't the first time Homer's poem has found its way onto the screen. The Odyssey has been adapted for film and television for well over a century. Direct adaptations include the silent Italian film L'Odissea from 1911, Ulysses in 1954 starring Kirk Douglas, and more recently The Return starring Ralph Fiennes released in 2024. A film that, despite being a solid and thoughtful adaptation, was largely ignored by audiences. But Homer's influence stretches far beyond literal adaptations. The Coen brothers' O Brother Where Art Thou is essentially a Depression-era retelling of the Odyssey. And yes, believe it or not, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie is also inspired by Odysseus' journey home. Whether it's high art or children's animation, Homer's story continues to find new life in every generation. Interestingly, this isn't Nolan's first encounter with Greek mythology. Back in the early 2000s, he was briefly attached to direct Troy before Wolfgang Peterson ultimately made the film with Brad Pitt and Eric Bana. Nolan has also spoken in interviews over the years about images and ideas inspired by the Iliad and the Odyssey that had stayed with him for decades. Clearly, this wasn't a project he stumbled into. It feels like something he's wanted to make for a very long time. And he certainly didn't think small. This is the first feature film shot entirely with IMAX cameras, and reportedly the most expensive R-rated film ever made. That alone makes it an enormous gamble. How do you condense one of history's most famous and complicated stories into under 3 hours? How do you remain faithful while also making it unmistakably your own? Those are difficult questions, and for the most part, I think Nolan finds the right answers. After months of filming across multiple countries, endless online speculations, and what felt like an infinite number of debates before anyone had ever seen the movie, it's finally here. The tickets went online more than a month in advance, and I thought for all the hate the film was getting prior to release, I would be able to easily buy tickets for the opening weekend. But nope. It took me 5 days to actually watch it. Every single IMAX 70mm showing in my city was sold out, so I had no choice but to wait. Thankfully, it was worth it. I had some issues with the film which I will get to soon, but first let's start with the positives. This is one of those rare films that genuinely demands the biggest screen possible. The sheer scale of the photography, the sound, the image quality, the overwhelming presence of everything happening on screen. Watching this at home simply won't provide the same experience. If you have access to IMAX 70mm screens in your city, I genuinely recommend making the effort. Some movies benefit from premium formats, and this one practically requires them. One thing I appreciated almost immediately was how accessible the film is. Whether you've read Homer's poem or you're experiencing this story for the first time, the film works well. The poem is very much open to different interpretations, and naturally, Nolan takes plenty of liberties. Some characters are rearranged, events are condensed, certain relationships are altered, and entire sections are reinterpreted. But that's exactly what screen adaptations are supposed to do. This isn't a filmed audiobook. It's Christopher Nolan's interpretation of an ancient text. Visually, it fits perfectly alongside the rest of his filmography. Everything feels earthy, practical, minimal, and grounded. Even when the story ventures into mythology, Nolan never abandons his preference for practicality. No, the armors aren't historically accurate. Same with the ships, costumes, dialects. But honestly, none of that ever bothered me. Every film adaptation filters its source material through the artistic sensibilities of its director. This one simply filters Greek mythology through Christopher Nolan's worldview. As long as a film adaptation remains close to the source material's spirit, I'm happy happy with it. And this film does, I think. Personally, I would have probably preferred something stranger, something more colorful, more mythical, more dreamlike. Greek mythology is filled with impossible creatures, bizarre landscapes, gods interfering with mortals, witches, monsters, and magical islands. I would have happily embraced a version that leaned completely into that imagination. I would have also loved to see a film starring entirely Greek actors speaking reconstructed ancient Greek with subtitles. But let's be realistic, that simply isn't the kind of $250 million studio production Hollywood finances, even one made by Nolan. So I will judge the film based on what it's trying to be, not what I personally would have made if I was a filmmaker. Technically, the film is exceptional. The cinematography is stunning, the music is great, the sound design is among the best Nolan has ever had, and almost every major sequence is staged with incredible precision. There's something wonderfully old-fashioned about the craftsmanship. Rather than relying on overwhelming CGI spectacle, Nolan builds as much as possible physically. You feel the weight of the ships, the environments, the costumes, the action. It recalls the Hollywood epics of decades past where everything had texture and physicality. Of course there are CGI and visual effects here, there have to be, but they never overwhelm the image. Instead of another lousy, weightless, CGI-heavy swords and sandals movie, Nolan delivers something that actually feels handmade, and that makes all the difference, I think. Several sequences stand out to me. The Cyclops cave sequence is absolutely fantastic. It's tense, it's frightening, it's wonderfully directed, and honestly, it plays like a horror movie sequence. Watching it made me wonder what a Christopher Nolan horror movie would actually look like. The flashbacks involving the Trojan horse are also impressive. The film focuses on the psychological tension inside the horse, and we experience the uncertainty alongside Odysseus and his men. It's suspenseful, claustrophobic, and brilliantly executed. The violence throughout the film is also surprisingly brutal. Nobody feels safe. Odysseus loses companions constantly, so don't get attached to anyone. There's a very good chance they won't survive the next island. The ending is also great. Even with the liberties Nolan takes, the emotional payoff lands very well. And there's one short scene involving Samantha Morton that, without spoiling anything, became my favorite moment in the entire movie. Structurally, the film follows the original poem's non-linear storytelling, which is fitting because Nolan has practically built his career doing exactly that. The fragmented narrative works, but it also creates one of the film's biggest weaknesses for me. The story becomes somewhat episodic. Characters appear, disappear, then reappear much later. And because the cast is absolutely enormous, many actors barely receive any screen time. Zendaya, Lupita Nyong'o, Elliot Page, and so many others only appear for a handful of minutes. This is very much Matt Damon's movie, and I'll admit, he wasn't my first choice for Odysseus, but he won me over. He carries the emotional burden of the film very well, and among the supporting cast, for me, Anne Hathaway and John Leguizamo both delivered the best performances of their careers. Something Nolan has always understood is that spectacle means very little without emotional stakes. Despite directing films involving black holes, dream worlds, magicians, and larger-than-life events, his stories almost always revolve around family dynamics, and the Odyssey fits naturally into those themes. You can immediately understand why Nolan connected with this material. At its core, this isn't just a story about monsters and gods. It's about a man trying to get back home to his family. No matter how enormous the sets become or how spectacular the action gets, the emotional center never disappears. Some scenes genuinely surprised me with how moving they were. And if you're a dog person, let's just say one particular sequence might hit you harder than you expect. Nolan's interpretation of the Odyssey also focuses a lot on the impacts of war and PTSD, while questioning the nature of war altogether. Now, the film is not flawless, and there were things in it that I didn't like. I actually think the opening is one of the weaker parts of the film. It took me a while to settle into the rhythm of the storytelling. There are also sections in the middle that slightly hurt the pacing. Due to the episodic nature of the story, some sections felt a bit rushed, and the characters felt underdeveloped. Another criticism is something I felt about Nolan for years. He's almost too committed to reality, even when dealing with fantasy. This is completely subjective, I know, and it's absolutely deliberate on Nolan's part, but it's something I felt for many of his films. The way the gods are portrayed here, for example, completely fits the rules Nolan establishes. It makes sense, it's internally consistent, but it never felt unique or original to me. I keep expecting to see him completely unleash his imagination, to abandon realism for just a few moments, and he never really does. I've had this criticism for many of his films, including Inception. That film mostly takes place inside dream worlds, yet most of these worlds still look like our world with slight changes to gravity and movements. Imagine how visually insane those dreams could have become, like in Satoshi Kon's Paprika, for example. I feel something similar here. The Odyssey is a strange story full of gods, monsters, witches, magic, impossible islands, and so much more. Nolan translates those ideas into something grounded and believable. And yes, it works for the movie he's trying to make, but I just can't help wishing he'd occasionally allow himself to become completely detached from reality, to embrace visual chaos, to let mythology feel truly mythical. That's simply not the aesthetic he likes to have in his films though, and whether that's a strength or a limitation probably depends on your taste and your expectations from a Christopher Nolan movie. Overall, I really enjoyed The Odyssey. I need to watch it again before deciding exactly where it ranks among Nolan's filmography for me, because this is the kind of movie that deserves multiple viewings, I think. But my first impression is quite positive. It's ambitious, the filmmaking is great, it's emotionally engaging, and above all, it's a film that demands your attention. In an era dominated by nonsensical streaming slop, endless franchise entries, lazy CGI spectacles, and creatively bankrupt remakes, it's refreshing to see a filmmaker convince a major Hollywood studio to spend hundreds of millions of dollars adapting a 3,000-year-old epic poem using practical filmmaking and IMAX cameras. Even if it isn't perfect, movies like this have become rare and should be cherished while they're out there.